Delighted to have you, Zim, and Peter and Amy. Great to have this presentation. I am aware. Hi, Sam. Um, I'm aware somewhat of the work that you have done regarding these parliamentary interviews that you were conducting, and so I have some familiarity with it, but I'm looking forward to hearing more about how the project has panned out and the findings you have. So with that really quick intro, I'd like to hand over the podium to you, Zim.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharam. Thank you all for coming. Sharam, you've been thrown into the chairing duty without any notice. Thank you very much for that. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Zim Wakora. I'm a political scientist here at Deakin, between the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and ADI. This paper is a collaboration between myself, Peter Ferguson, Amy Nethery, who are also in this room. And the paper extends a project that we've been working on for a couple of years now, maybe three years or so. The project was initially funded by the Parliament of Victoria, and with that initial grant funding, we studied the transition experiences of former members of Parliament as they exited from that career. Since then, we've done other work, including most recently an effort to devise codes of conduct for parliaments across the Commonwealth. So that work is ongoing. This particular slice, this paper, builds especially on the first study. And it is a little bit unusual compared to the other work we're doing because it's theoretical and more precisely normative rather than empirical. But I hope it complements the more empirical and practically minded work that we've been doing. Okay, that's a little bit by way of backdrop and background. If we think about this paper, it starts from the observation that departures from Parliament, so how parliamentarians leave that institution, are often deeply problematic, pretty much for everyone who is concerned with this particular event. So for all the stakeholders, this process, this exit from Parliament, works pretty badly. First of all, for citizens whom Parliament and parliamentarians are supposed to represent, they see things that make them deeply cynical, not only the scandals, but even more so the widespread belief that the ethos of Parliament is corrupt. In particular, when it comes to this departure lounge, or the exiting from Parliament, the concern is that politicians can easily enrich themselves as they transition out of Parliament. So citizens are unhappy. For the politicians themselves, the experience is typically worse than many citizens think. We definitely find some politicians who do rather well out of leaving Parliament. So the example in front of you, Josh Frydenberg, former treasurer, after losing his Kooyong seat, he ended up in a well-remunerated executive position at Goldman Sachs. Other recent examples include Bill Shorten, who is moving on to the vice chancellorship at the University of Canberra, Christopher Pyne, who's done well out of his connections with the defense industry. So those are some examples that lead to this general reputation. But our research based in Victoria and other research that's coming out of ANU based on the federal and the ACT experience suggests that actually those sorts of outcomes that I've just cited, the type that make the front pages of the newspapers, are actually quite unusual. We might view that as being the tip of the iceberg. Unfortunately, that tip contaminates the perception of the rest of the iceberg. The reality is that for most MPs, 90% of them, most of whom will have never been cabinet ministers, most of whom are not well-known figures, the exit from Parliament is often very stressful. It's associated with various kinds of hardship, emotional, financial, and employment. And certainly for most, it is not a gravy train, quite the opposite. Often they're quite toxic to potential employers after they leave their parliamentary career. Indeed, one of the pathologies, the problems of the exit from Parliament that most politicians face is that they don't want to go because what follows is likely to be quite miserable. And so we have the phenomenon of hangers-on who stay in the parliament well beyond the time that they would ideally like to leave and well beyond their use-by date as far as good quality representation is concerned. So the exit, this leaving of parliament is deeply problematic from a number of vantage points. So if the exit is problematic, it's not working well, how might we fix it? How do we fix the exit from parliament? And basically, I think there are responses to this question that fall into three categories. The first might be called the populist reactions, summarized by phrases such as "let them drown," "burn them at the stake." And that's what we get from some quarters when folks hear about this parliamentary careers research project. There are obvious drawbacks to that particular populist approach, both for the human beings who would be drowned or burned, but also for the wider performance of the system of representative democracy. So that's one strand, deeply problematic for reasons I've just intimated. The second approach is more practical, and this is the approach that we see in some practitioner reports, including the report in front of you there, written by the Public Administration Committee of the United Kingdom, and it offers benchmarks and practical suggestions and generally highlights the problems of MPs at their point of departure from elected office. So the report's called Smoothing the Cliff, and it offers a range of supports and really just talks up the problems and experiences in this area, makes the problem visible. And that's an approach that has received some traction in the UK and elsewhere. What has been missing from this discussion, in our view, has been a reasoned, principle-based approach to this issue of how to structure parliamentary exit. In other words, a theory of how this ought to be set up. And such a theory should help us understand what is at stake, why we hold the views that we do, and hopefully reveal some counterintuitive points that are relevant to design. And so the purpose of the paper is to address this gap by taking steps toward a political theoretical approach to parliamentary career exit. And what I want to do in the remainder of the talk is take you through the steps that one might follow to build such a plausible account. So my starting point, and perhaps the most important move that this paper makes, is to think about the rules and arrangements that structure the exit from Parliament as an institution. And this is very natural for me as someone who works on political institutions, but I think it's quite unusual vis-a-vis the literature on this topic. This move, however, opens up an interesting perspective, which I'll elaborate more. But first of all, what do we mean when we think of the exit from Parliament as an institution? If we follow social science research on institutions, then we can define institutions following, especially Douglas North, as humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. That's a fairly classic definition now. There are variants of it, but that's what people understand as an institution across literatures in political science, sociology, economics, economic history, and other fields. Now, if we apply that definition, then the structures and rules that shape a parliamentary career can qualify as an institution. We might add some nuance to this and call it a micro or meso institution, but it's an institution of sorts under that definition. And once we make that move, then we can go about doing what institutionalists do in their work, which is they think about questions of comparison, comparing different institutions. They think about evaluation, so assessing different institutions, and they think about the design of institutions. And so we do this with quintessential institutions such as constitutions, electoral systems, and so on. My suggestion is we can do this sort of work with the exit from Parliament when we conceive of it as an institution. So when thinking about the design of an institution, it's often helpful to root our thinking in normative theory. So for example, when we think about electoral design and its effects on such things as participation, we build on a normative theory of participation. For constitutions, we might build on a normative theory of deliberation. For parliamentary career exit as an institution, I think the central building blocks can be found in the theory of representation. So representative theory, and I think there are strong reasons to ground the normative basis in that field, given the role of parliaments and the centrality of representative questions to the issue at hand. Now, if we are grounding our approach in the theory of representation, that means we are building on the shoulders of giants, including the three individuals in the slide in front of you. Edmund Burke, who's a British and philosopher who proposed different kinds of representatives, different forms of representation. James Madison, who was the primary architect of the United States Constitution, which of course was a grand experiment in representative government. And finally, another important person in this representative field is Hannah Pitkin, who
lived 300 years.
Yeah. Sorry?
She lived 300 years.
That's right before the age.
Oh, yeah. Who, much to my disappointment, lived 300 years apparently. So that's quite the typo. Amongst my collection of typos, that's a classic. Okay, so Pitkin, whose concept of representation, written when she was approximately 250 years old, remains the modern point of departure for much of the theoretical work in this field. So what we want to do is ground this idea of parliamentary exit as an institution in representative theory. As I'll say in a moment, that theory, I think, provides the central building blocks, but on its own, it's not sufficient. So we need to go a little bit beyond the theory of representation and incorporate ideas from other theoretical schools of thought. And even when we do that, what we end up with is a relatively loose framework that provides a set of resources within which to think about these questions around exit design. What we don't get is a really fine-grained playbook or guidebook or toolkit or anything of that sort. So what we get is a set of principles within which we can think about, debate, and hopefully assess parliamentary exit in practice. So grounding our thinking in the theory of representation, there's a few points of reference that it's worth drawing attention to. There's a vast scholarship on representation that can be summarized usefully in two directions. Firstly, historically, and secondly, conceptually. So historically, a potted modern history might begin with the mid-century theorists, Robert Dowell, etc., who emphasized the value of representation, the necessity of representation is really important. It's necessary because direct democracy cannot be easily achieved in a large-scale democracy. And that line of thinking contrasts the earlier view and older thought of theorists such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a very, very strong advocate of direct democracy. The mid-century theorists, Dowell and his contemporaries, highlighted the importance of responsiveness, and particularly the need for representation to respond to the views of the majority. This is a period in which majoritarian models of democracy become famous. Ideas such as the median voter theorem emerge during this period as well. And so we have this idea that representation is a good thing, particularly if it can effectively represent the views of the majority. That approach, which became very mainstream in political science, was challenged by radical and feminist theories in the 1960s, 1970s, and it's been challenged more recently by deliberative theorists. And in response to that, the theory of representation now gives more attention to matters of inclusion and inclusivity. So the concern is not only for those in the majority, but also for those at the periphery, at the political margins. especially when defined in terms of gender, ethnicity, race, and so on. So that's, if you like, a really potted history of representation theory, and that progression, and in a sense, the expansion of representation from the median person to the more marginal people in a political system, it can be described using Pitkin's typology, which continues to dominate the conceptual literature on representation. So we can think of the mid-century theorists as shifting the focus from formal and symbolic representation to really substantive questions, and more modern theorists taking a greater interest in questions of descriptive representation. So that's a really, really short summary of some key reference points in the theory and scholarship on representation. And from that literature, I think we can glean a few important implications for parliamentary career exit, and three principles stand out. The first implication from this body of work concerns representatives' motivations. So following representative theory, ideally, we want to structure exit. We want a set of rules and practices and arrangements around parliamentary exit that maximizes representation and minimizes shirking in the parliament. So we want exit to be structured so that representatives have a strong motivation to be good representatives, so they represent citizens really effectively and enthusiastically. That's principle number one, coming from the theory of representation. A second implication concerns career choice. So not only do we want to motivate the people who are representatives, we want people who are keen to be representatives to be putting up their hand to do this. So we want to select motivated aspirants, and that's at a individual micro level. And then at a kind of more macro level, we want to generate an inclusive collective of representatives. So we want representatives who collectively capture the views and perspectives of the society they purport to represent. And thirdly, the theory of representation suggests that we want to structure this exit, this departure lounge, if you like, in a way that minimizes the harmful lobbying practices that can get in the way of good representation. So lobbying could drive a wedge between the laws that are passed and what might be reasonably considered the public interest. We want to make sure that the departure lounge does not advance those sorts of lawmaking distortions. So the goal should be to minimize them. So those are, I think, the three principles that come most easily from the broader theory of representation that are directly relevant to us thinking about this departure lounge. As I mentioned earlier, I think the theory of representation is a sensible anchor for a normative account of the structuring of parliamentary career exit, but it's also necessary to go a little bit beyond that. And I think that it's necessary to take on a couple of principles that are not directly derived from representation theory, or if they are, then it's much more tenuous. But these are also important to thinking about parliamentary career exit. The first of these two supplementary principles is equality. And the principle there is ideally we want to structure the exit from parliament in a way that keeps representatives materially connected to the citizens that they're meant to represent. So the exit from parliament shouldn't exacerbate the issues of inequality that many societies experience. And fifthly, while the theory of representation is really it's a systems level theory, it's concerned with the congruence between individuals and their representatives, we might also have a concern for the individuals who come out of parliament, then a much more person-specific concern. And there we are thinking about individual welfare. So that's kind of a fifth principle. We want to structure the exit from parliament to minimize unnecessary harm to the individuals affected. So we don't want to cause any more pain to people's lives than we ought to. So those are the 5 principles, 3 from representative theory, 1, if you like, from theories around equality, and one from theories around individual welfare. And with those 5 principles, we can begin to assess parliamentary career exit. But before doing that, let me say a little bit more on this idea of exit as an institution, just to make it a bit more concrete for that assessment. So to begin with, it's important to note that there is a substantial number of rules when it comes to the structure of parliamentary career exit. These are mainly discussed in 2 research agendas. Firstly, there's a scholarship on exiting from Parliament, parliamentary career exit. It discusses material or income support of various kinds, as well as various kinds of non-material support. That includes counseling and the like. We've done some previous work. That Ferguson et al. 2023 paper is a paper that we did that looks at different rules when it comes to these transitions across different Commonwealth parliaments. So we might put both aspects, so the material support and the non-material support, on a dimension spanning from very generous to not so generous, right? So that would mean that, you know, we can imagine structuring material support in a way that is extremely generous to people who are leaving, giving them a lot of money when they leave, or giving them nothing when they leave, right? That's one question. We might also ask how generous should the non-material support be? Should we be offering a lot of counseling to people who leave Parliament or none, right? So to take the 2 polar extremes. So those are 2 dimensions of exit. There's a 3rd dimension that it's worth highlighting as well, and that's captured in the scholarship on lobbying rules. And here, there's much discussion of the so-called revolving door phenomenon. This is the idea that politicians can leave Parliament, take up well-paying lobbying jobs, which allow them to exploit their contacts, political loyalties, and other job-specific assets that they gained while they were in Parliament. So we can characterize these revolving door provisions in various ways, but there's an important study that suggests that they can be absent, which means that politicians can go and get any job in industry after leaving Parliament. They can be present, but weakly enforced and brief. So there's like a period of time when politicians can't go into the industry that they recently regulated or were involved with in politics. And sometimes those regulations aren't really well enforced. So basically there's a weakness to that regime, or those revolving door provisions can be very strongly enforced and very lengthy. You know, at least hypothetically, you could have it for the rest of the individual's lifetime, right? So those are 3 dimensions along which we can think about the structuring of parliamentary exit. So in terms of material support, non-material support, and lobbying rules. And so what I want to do is ask, how should each of those dimensions be designed given the principles that we've outlined? So the exit model, as I've said, consists of 3 elements. So some combination of material support, non-material support, and lobbying opportunities. So the key question for us then becomes this: what is the ideal design of these 3 elements? How should they be set up given our priors around representative theory? So first of all, let's evaluate material support. How much generosity? How generous should the material support be? And as I say, this kind of thinking doesn't lead us to a dollar figure. It doesn't say, oh, you should be paying former MPs this amount of money for this length of time. Instead, it establishes a principle, a way of a relatively a loose but still helpful guideline set of principles for how we would approach this problem. And from there, we can get more nitty-gritty if the principles are reasonable. So first of all, when it comes to how much generosity, there are the theory of representation cuts both ways. So on the one hand, if you give members too little when they leave, you risk this hangers-on problem that MPs don't want to leave Parliament because the prospect of life outside is very, very onerous. This is the motivation behind that UK report, smoothing the cliff. So it's very much motivated by that sense that you don't want to make it too difficult for them to leave Parliament, because then they'll want to stay a little bit too much. On the other hand, if you make it too generous for them to leave, then there's a different incentive, which is that MPs will want to get into Parliament primarily so that they can move on from Parliament, right? So they use it as a way station to move on to secure this benefit of having been in Parliament and then leaving. So it cuts both ways. If it's too meager, you risk hangers-on. If it's too generous, you risk mass desertion. So you want a moderately generous position between those two extremes. And then there's another principle that's relevant too, which is the fourth principle, equality. And there, the equality principle, whatever you decide is moderate, the equality principle will generally force that downwards. It's a downward pressure. It's a downward pressure primarily to avoid politicians getting out of touch with the standard of living of ordinary citizens. The strength of that downward pressure will vary across societies and economic circumstances. So the point is that if you're imagining the material support for one country that is rich versus the material support for another country which is poor, you'd imagine that there would be a material difference, and that would be because of that principle. Now that's relevant because if you actually look at the conditions across countries, often you don't see conditions that are congruent with the general societal circumstances. So, MPs' conditions can be sometimes well aligned with median wages. In other cases, they can be many, many times median wages. So this fourth principle is important because it suggests that the conditions for an MP should be embedded and set and at least conditioned by the circumstances of the wider society. So that's, an overall outline of where we should be aiming for in terms of the material support. It should be moderately generous, and as I say, there should be a downward pressure because of the equality consideration. When it comes to non-material support, there is, I think, very little reason not to be highly generous here. So first of all, from the theory of representation, being really generous with non-material support will broaden the attractiveness of Parliament to diverse groups. There's plenty of evidence on this now, that one of the things that puts off people from diverse backgrounds, defined in pretty much any way from parliamentary careers, is the absence of non-material support. And there's a lot that parliaments can do that, we've learned from comparative experience. They can set up former members clubs, they can provide counseling, they can provide all sorts of non-material support that can help individuals transition out of Parliament. And this is important for representation, also important for individuals' welfare. And there's really no reason not to be highly generous and to invest extremely heavily in this. So we prescribe an approach that is moderately generous when it comes to material support, highly generous when it comes to non-material support. And finally, when it comes to lobbying, from the theory of representation, and in particular the principle around lawmaking distortions, we think there's a very strong case for restricting the activities of lawmakers here. So strong restrictions, this limits the risk of distortions, which are, if you like, from a representative theory standpoint, very problematic, because this leads to outcomes that are not conducive to the public interest. So there's a very strong justification here, in our view, for a highly restrictive setting. So if we pull all of this together, there emerges at least the loose outlines of a normatively desirable model, a model of exit that is moderately generous in terms of material support, highly generous with regard to non-material support, and highly restrictive in terms of revolving door rules. Now, if you were to think about those fairly pithy, but I think useful guidelines, and then you were to start thinking comparatively, and how does, for example, Australia look when we compare it against those guidelines? The answer might be in some ways okay, in other ways not so okay. So, for example, I wouldn't say that Australia has highly restrictive revolving door rules. But of course, that is got to be seen, as this model suggests, in conjunction with the other elements of exit. So, one of the problems, in my view, of this literature and the way these discussions take place is that the material support for politicians is often divorced from the discussion around what they do after they finish their political career, so around lobbying and so on. And those conversations need to be brought together, because it's all constitutive of this departure from Parliament. So if you have a situation where you say, politicians, we're not going to give you anything when you leave Parliament, and actually you can't take up any jobs, well, that just leaves a very, very unsustainable outcome. One of the implications of this model that we're moving towards, however, is it suggests that there's a number of ways of structuring this exit process. If this is the desirable one, then one of the less desirable approaches is having very little material support while having very loose revolving door rules, which is, I think, a very common approach across parliaments, right? So you kind of say, well, we're not going to give you anything because that feeds the populist impulses, but we're not going to really restrict what you do beyond Parliament. Instead, we're just going to set up a really weak regime there. And my argument is actually that outcome is much worse for society and representation than the alternative, which is to be moderately generous with the exit package and to be stricter with the lobbying rules. So that's, if you like, one set of conclusions that follows from this. I should add the caveat that this whole approach applies primarily to professionalized parliaments. So parliaments where people who are in the parliament are doing that as a political career, right? They're doing that as a way to earn money to feed themselves and their families and so on. So they're not amateurs. This is their income. This is their livelihood, and therefore we need to be serious about what is practical. And secondly, we're thinking about parliaments in countries that can afford relatively, they have a lot of scope when it comes to the spending that they could afford for their politicians. So we're imagining a country where actually public services don't have adequate funding, and therefore matters of infrastructure and education and health are clearly the priorities for the state. Then maybe there's not a case for even thinking in a really sustained way about the set of problems much lower down the priority list. But in many advanced countries, the structure of parliament is a live issue. It's an important issue. It's one that needs to be front and center in our minds. Final caveat: these provisions could be part of a bigger conversation around parliamentary behavior. So you can imagine a situation where the conditions that you set for politicians are contingent on good behavior, and therefore that might be a way of not only incentivizing better behavior from parliamentarians, but also reducing the risk that people leave the parliament under conditions of scandal and then get some benefits, which of course, if that happened over time, would erode trust in parliaments and lead us into problems of representation of a different kind. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.